Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Summer Fundraising. Really glad to be here with all of you. We'll give everyone just a minute or so to get settled in before we dive into this week's topic, but I will say I'm really glad to be here with all of you, and I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't say happy first day of summer to all of you. Although I have to say here in Vancouver, it is like anything but summer-like outside right now. It's kind of overcast, and I think it was actually raining a little bit earlier, so hopefully it will actually be warm and sunny at some point this summer here. I find that June is often kind of a strange weather month in Vancouver. So anyways, I hope it's nicer where you are today, as I'm sure it probably is for many of you. Those of you who are listening in here in Crowdcast with us, I would love for you to say hello in the chat box. It's always great to see who's tuning in with us each week. For those of you who are watching over on Facebook Live, hello and welcome. If you'd like to join us over on Crowdcast to be a part of the conversation and join in with the Q&A, you can find us over at crowdcast.io/Vanessa E. Chase. You'll find a listing for it there. Oh, hello to Emily and Stacy and Christy. And let's see, we've got Sarah. Great to see you all here. And we've got lots of other people tuning in as well. So what are we doing here this week? So you're tuning into my weekly live show, which is called Summer Fundraising. It's a 30-minute live broadcast to help provide you with some extra fundraising inspiration this summer. And all summer long through the end of August, we're covering a lot of different topics related to fundraising and communications and, of course, storytelling. And I'm really excited to be bringing these to you each week. And starting next week, we've got a series of some pretty cool guests coming on, and I'll tell you about that towards the end of today's episode. A couple of quick housekeeping items. If you do have questions as we go throughout the broadcast, I'd love for you to submit those. You can do that using the chat box. And there's also a button just below the live video feed. You'll see, and I see a couple of people have already asked some questions there, so you're welcome to submit your questions. You can also upvote questions if there's ones you think are really interesting and you'd like me to answer those first, so feel free to do that as well. Finally, before we get into today's topic, just below the video here, there is a button that says share. So if you feel so inclined to share this on your social media channels, feel free to share it with your friends and colleagues. And we'll also have the recording up on blog probably tomorrow as well, if you want to share that. All right, so let's go ahead and get into today's topic. So I know a lot of you are really eager to talk about the question that I posed this morning, which is, what is the story that you're telling over time? And I thought this would be a really interesting topic because I think that so often the vantage point that we talk about storytelling from is one of what I would call more episodic storytelling, where we're telling the story of an individual or a project or a person or a place, anything like that, where it's kind of one vignette. And I think the danger with kind of that, I guess, like narrow sort of definition or approach to storytelling is that sometimes we miss the opportunities for the bigger overarching stories or narratives and what communications might call messaging over time, which is also a kind of storytelling. It's a little bit more elusive and conceptual, but I do think it's an important thing to talk about and consider because it really is the narrative that you're communicating to your audience over a period of time that's telling them about what the work is, what it is you do, why it's important, answering those really essential questions. And in a lot of ways, it's forming your brand identity, which is people's perception of your organization. So there's a lot of really interesting things to think about here, and I'm hoping to cover a couple of points about that and, of course, answer a lot of the questions that have come in already. I wanted to start just with a little bit about these ideas of episodic storytelling versus sort of long-term narrative, just to explain those a little bit more, because I think those will be terms that I come back to a couple of times here today. So as I said, episodic stories are more of those individual stories. They're an episode, which is where episodic comes from. And as I said, they're sort of vignettes. They're the ones that I think we see most often in nonprofit storytelling. It's a story about an individual, a project, a place, an organization, whatever that might be. But they're usually used on sort of profiles or in newsletters, in appeal letters, those sorts of things. I'm sure you can probably think about what those are and maybe even think of a few examples that you've maybe told recently. Now, the long-term narrative, which is the one that I want to talk about here today with this question that I posed, is really the kind of sum or the result of all of those stories or communications that your organization tells over time. Now, for a lot of organizations, they do think about this, and maybe you do as well when you do communications planning or message planning, something like that. But I see a lot of organizations running into the issue of only thinking about sort of one campaign or one project at a time and kind of taking those individually, and not necessarily thinking about how those are connecting over time and what sort of story or message they're communicating to the audience. And so that's where I hope we can kind of take this conversation today, just talk a little bit more about the difference between those two things, and also how you can really start getting a grasp on this larger narrative that your organization is communicating, and thinking more strategically about how you can leverage that in communications and also in fundraising. So the question I posed earlier, and I mentioned it a couple of times now, is this question of what story are you telling over time? And so I'm sure some of you might be like, well, how do I figure that out if I'm not really sure what it is? So there's a really key step in this, and I would really encourage a lot of folks to think about doing this, especially in the summer if you have a little bit more time or bandwidth in your schedule. And that first step is to actually do your own sort of audit of your fundraising or communications materials, depending on where your sort of focus is. And the reason I always suggest an audit, and I always do this with groups whenever I work on communications planning, is because it will really give you sort of an objective rear view look of what your organization has done, what you've actually said to people, and what messages you've actually communicated, not just the ones that you wanted to communicate that you had in a plan somewhere. And there's a lot of ways you can go about doing this, and it can get really overwhelming. So feel free to just scale it back to a way that makes more sense for your organization. I typically will look at anywhere from 6 to 12 months of communication for an organization when I do this sort of auditing for them, which is a lot, especially if they've got a lot of different channels and a lot of ways that they're communicating with people. So you can kind of pick and choose which ones you want to focus on, and what ones make the most sense for your organization. But what I'll basically do is I'll get all of these communications and I'll start to sort of lay them out and take notes on them and think about, well, what is the message that was communicated in this piece, and do that for all of them. And once I've done that, I'll look and see, is there some coherence? Is there a natural progression in these messages? They kind of build on each other over time. Are they really unrelated, or maybe not necessarily cohesive in a really useful way? And that's, of course, a useful question to be thinking about, because if it's not, then there's a real obvious opportunity to improve them. So that's sort of the very quick guide to running an audit. There's a lot more that I could say about that. I'm happy to answer questions if folks have questions about that more specifically. But the thing that I really encourage people to look for in audit materials is, one, what are the key messages that you're communicating? And two, are they consistent? What are you actually telling people? And I think for a lot of organizations, it's really surprising to do these audits because, you really are focused on one appeal or one campaign, as I said, and sometimes we don't necessarily look at the whole sort of retrospective of all of those communications. As I said, I think sometimes this process can be a little bit overwhelming for organizations. So you might just want to focus on one channel, maybe just your newsletter even, or maybe, just one social media channel, maybe just your Facebook post, something like that. Those are really great places to start if you just want to delve into the process a little bit. And then once you do one, if you found it really generative, really useful, maybe look at another one and see, what can we do there to improve? And that can be sort of an incremental progression in doing this sort of audit that can be very helpful. So as you start to think about, what is the story that you're telling, I think, and you figure out what that is, the next sort of question to think about is, what story do you actually want to be telling? And this is where sort of creative foresight and strategic thinking really come into place for a lot of organizations. And it's where you start to think about, what are the messages that you do actually want to be communicating with people, and how can you make sure you effectively do this? And part of this is definitely message planning. And if you've never done anything like message planning before for your organization, the basic way that I like to explain it to people are, these are sort of the key talking points that you want to make sure that you communicate, whether it's in appeals or newsletters or something else. They're the definite points that you want to be getting across over, the span of a quarter or maybe even a year. And a lot of organizations will sit down and look at those key messages on a regular basis, maybe annually if they're doing a plan, to really think about, how can we make sure we get these points across to people? And that's what I want to encourage you to do, because if you think about those strategically and you're able to ultimately communicate those messages, you're going to really be in control of that narrative that you're sharing over time. And there's a lot of creative things you can do with it. You know, you can focus messages just on certain programs or services. You can focus on building a message arc that ultimately, you know, helps sort of build up your audience's knowledge of what your organization is doing and hopefully sort of deepens the relationship in fundraising, which is always a great thing to think about. And, you know, there's other ways you can also think about this as well, being able to ultimately be more effective in your communications. I always, you know, encourage people to think about, you know, how can you be more effective in making sure that your message, your bigger story really does get communicated to people. And it starts with planning. And I feel like I come back to this point quite often, but that's really because planning is such a foundational piece of so much of the fundraising communications work that we do in the nonprofit sector. So as you get those messages in place, as you've kind of identified what those things are that you want to communicate, the kind of next sort of progressive step in that is to think about how do you want to narratively communicate those points. So can you tell an individual story? Can you tell the story of a project or place or object to help communicate that point? Is there another sort of narrative structure that you can use to communicate that point and get people engaged with what it is you have to say? And that's where you sort of start to see episodic stories and that long-term narrative sort of start to overlap a little bit more. And that's how they kind of ultimately merge together and become, you know, two tools, two sets of things that really work together very effectively. So that's kind of a quick rundown on both what those two things are, how they work together, and also how you can sort of start to strategically think about doing audits and being able to strategically control or hopefully be able to use that narrative more effectively for your organization. Let's see. So I wanted to answer a couple of questions. I'm going to just pause here and answer a few. I think, let's see, we'll go with Sarah's question here first, and we'll start that one. So Sarah, you asked, our story has been around for a while, and I'm discovering that the story is obscure to most people. How do we update our approach to telling our founding story? Oh, what a good question. So I'm actually working on this with a client right now, figuring out how to actually tell their organizational or their founding story more effectively. And there's a couple of things that I think about whenever I work on more sort of this overarching narrative for an organization. So one, if you've got a narrative in place already, you've got some sort of copy or material that you can work with, the first thing to look at is, you know, what's working about this and what's not. So there's a couple of things you can do. You, of course, can assess it yourself. You could also use focus groups. You can survey people internally, your organization or your constituency, to really see how much people's perception and knowledge actually overlaps with what you are putting out into the community. And I think that's a really good sort of litmus test to see, you know, what is actually resonating and sticking with people and what are they picking up on and really keying into. The other thing that I always think about with founding stories, especially if you're in sort of a niche where there's a lot of other organizations who are doing similar work, I find this is true for most types of organizations, really. But in that founding story, being able to really communicate what is your key differentiator as an organization. In sort of the business vernacular, we would call this your unique value proposition. And I think nonprofit organizations have this too. Every organization has an angle or philosophy or some sort of approach to the work that makes their approach different from another organization. And often that's why they were founded. I can think of a group that I work with here in Vancouver, and they're a rape crisis center. Some of you have probably heard me talk about them before. But there's a lot of other kind of women's services in town. There's, you know, the police victim support unit. There's battered women's support services. There's domestic violence groups. There's also transitional housing. And then there's this rape crisis center that I work with. So there's a lot of different overlapping services kind of in that niche to serve women who are experiencing some kind of violence in their life. And one of the things that we really wanted to do is be clear about who the organization was from a values perspective. And so they really strongly identify as a feminist rape crisis center. And so feminism became one of the key differentiators for them in how they talk about their work and how they sort of developed a philosophy around serving women in the community. And that's been really important for them in their founding story and in their narrative as an organization, to make sure that people know exactly why they're different and to kind of refresh that a little bit more. So that's something that I would encourage you to think about. One is, what is your differentiator? And also, what is actually resonating and what's not resonating in that story with people? I think you'll be able to find a lot of really useful data points from there and be able to start developing that story a little bit more. All right. Yeah, oh, I'm glad that's helpful, Sarah. All right, so we've got a couple more questions here that I'll answer. All right, so Rebecca, so you said through our numbers of people served, though your number of people served increases year to year, our program story is fairly static because we provided the same direct service year after year over the past few years. How do we build upon that story over time so that doesn't really change much? Sorry, I'm going to reread this. How do we build upon a story over time that doesn't really change too much over shorter periods of time in 2 to 3 years? So that's a great question, Rebecca. And I think there's a couple of things you can think about. With social service groups that I've worked with before, you're right, the programs do stay fairly similar. That I worked with here in town had sort of 3 core service areas, which were providing kids services, so after school programs, things like that, community meals, and then an alcohol and drug recovery program that they offered. It was really those 3 things, although they had other programs, that's what they were known for. And so they were consistently every single year raising money for those programs. And there really wasn't much that was changing in those programs. What we had to think about as an organization, both as marketers and fundraisers, was how can we continue to make sure that we position the messaging about why this program is important and the stories that we tell about it in a way that will really resonate with our audience. And part of what your job is as a fundraiser and communicator is over time continuing to refine what resonates with your audience. So I would really think about, the story that you're telling over time as an opportunity to continue to really laser in on what that is. So you may not necessarily have a strong idea of what that is now, or maybe you do. Being able to test new things, try out different messaging, tell different perspectives or different stories in the process to see what's really resonating with people will help you to both be creative and also hone in on something that really will work for people. And I'll say that with the group that I mentioned, their message that resonated very well for a long time, I think probably like 20 plus years at this point, especially in their year-end campaign, was something like "Miracles begin with a meal." And I think the tagline after that was something like, "Your $3.25 can change a life." It was something like that, but that message, that kind of story really resonated with donors. And one of the things that we knew was that we didn't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel to make things radically different every year. And I think I mentioned this last week too, which is that, if you find something that's working, if you find a narrative structure that's working for your audience, finding a story that's working, you don't have to keep changing it. You can keep building on it, keep building out, keep telling new components to that story, keep adding in new voices and new perspectives, but you don't necessarily have to change that core message. And if you think about some of the larger, more successful organizations, maybe in your community or state or region, chances are you'll probably see that their message has been pretty steadfast. They're just really good at creatively getting that message out into the community. So that's another way that you can sort of think about that. I guess the other thing I would say too is, even if the story doesn't change, the opportunity, as I said, there is for you to really creatively think about how is it that you get this story or this message out into the community. So can you run a creative communications campaign? Could you run a really innovative, sort of crowdsourced content campaign, something like that? There's lots of opportunities to think about those pieces. And I think that's where you'll really find the opportunity to really bring that story and that message even more to life. Yeah, so I hope that helps, Rebecca. Let's see, got a couple more questions here. Melinda, oh, hi, Melinda, great to see you. So you said our board is really keen on getting a story of what we do and what we're about in the public eye. It keeps getting suggested, keeps suggesting that mainstream media is the place for it. They really want national stories. I think our current focus on success stories in hyper-local markets where we have specific impact would ultimately come together to have a more similar outcome with more reasonable building blocks that have meaning to our grassroots stakeholders. Thoughts for a one-person PR team with a minimal budget? Yeah, that's a really good question. I think this is such an interesting component of storytelling for a lot of organizations is getting those stories in the media and then thinking about how you leverage that media opportunity to be able to, I don't know, connect with new audiences and just really get sort of high level visible coverage for whatever it is your organization is working on. In terms of the approach to it, so you could certainly try if you wanted to pitching some some national news sources to see if you can get coverage there. The thing would be is that you'd have to have the right message or the right story that would appeal to a broader non-local audience. And that might be a challenge to figure out what that is. I think you're right. A lot of organizations do have much better success in a local market because they do local work and the local stories will appeal much more to those local media outlets. So let's see, where was I going with that? So I guess in that sense, I would say if that's working for you and you're finding that being able to connect with local media is working really well, then keep doing that. And then if you have bandwidth, if you have time, see about connecting with some larger national media outlets. Maybe you find a reporter who's covering work that's related to what you do. And Melinda, I'm pretty sure you guys work with kids on sort of health and fitness initiatives. So maybe there's some overlap there. I feel like maybe one angle, I feel like forever, there's always articles on, childhood obesity or I don't know, just issues around childhood health and fitness. Maybe there's some angle there that would connect with sort of a national audience and connect into what you guys do and how you're sort of looking to help support kids in a healthy way. That's just off the top of my head what I'm thinking. But that might be like one angle for that. But really, I think a big part of PR and getting stories out to the media is being able to connect with reporters. And that really requires you to do some relationship building ahead of time. So thinking about, who is it that covers these types of stories? How can you connect with them? Building that relationship so that when you do have a pitch, they're more likely to pay attention to it and ultimately take notice and hopefully report on it. It's definitely a tricky thing. I found with a couple of the groups that I've worked with, they have sort of a Rolodex of reporters that they've sort of collected over the years who they know cover issues related to their organization's work. And it's been much easier for them to kind of keep tabs on those reporters over the years rather than just sort of thinking about the news outlet more broadly. And that way they feel like they have a really solid contact that they can go to when they have a story to pitch. Yeah, so I hope that's helpful. Yeah, I mean, I think that just to go back and kind of summarize what I said, Melinda, I really think that one of the things that will be important for you if you're thinking about national media or sort of mainstream media focus is what is sort of the message that's going to connect with people that's not just locally related. And I'm pretty sure there is an angle to that for your work. It's just going to be a matter of thinking about what that is and then being able to get that placed somewhere. Yeah, if you have follow-up questions, let me know. Awesome. Yeah, so see a couple of you left comments. I'm just going to take a look at these quickly. Yeah, so Stacy, you said the special why seems harder for educational places. Where do you start to dig deeper? I think it's a really good question. So with educational institutions, I think every institution sort of has its own philosophy, its own approach to education, why they think education is important. For some groups, for some schools, that might be, religious focus or some sort of cultural focus. I know you work at a larger, more mainstream university, so that may not necessarily be the case. One thing you could do that might be really useful, and I know, Stacy, you work at the College of Dentistry, so you might want to look at other dentistry schools in Canada and think about, you can look at their web pages, for instance, and just read sort of the about their program section and think about, what are sort of the values they communicate? What are the things they emphasize for students entering their dentistry program? What are sort of the things that are really valued and important in their program? What do they hope to achieve or do as a result of educating these up and coming dentists in the world? And just take notes and see like what's similar to your page, what's different from your page. Being able to notice those things will really help you start to figure out where there's overlap, where there's things that are different, and also maybe where there's an opportunity to communicate something slightly different than what everyone else is communicating. So that's definitely what I would look at. And Kathy said, yeah, what impact is your school having on students? I think that's a good question. I often encourage people too to go back to their mission statement or their vision statement, because that's often, although we forget about it, is the place where organizations will often kind of articulate that unique sort of value proposition or unique angle or why on their work. So going back to just even that basic piece there can often be a really useful starting point as well. Yeah. All right, and Emily, I think you had a question from earlier. I'm just going to scroll up and find it, so give me just a second. All right, so Emily, you said, I was thinking today that perhaps part of the story we could capitalize on is that our volunteers and the sheer number of hours they donate of their time every year. How can you best include this? Yeah, so I would think that that's, I mean, that's certainly part of your organization's narrative, but to me, when I think about volunteers, I think about that being more of like one component of the story, whereas we're talking about the sort of bigger narrative. If you think that volunteers are such an integral piece to making the work happen, to getting it to sort of come to fruition, then by all means, volunteers certainly do play an interesting and important role in that. And you might want to figure out how they fit into that narrative, and how you might want to tell their story over time as well. But I would think that, you know, when you're illustrating the work, illustrating impact, sort of thinking about how you can communicate that message, telling the stories of individual volunteers or the group of volunteers might be one of the ways to ultimately include them that's a little bit more effective. Yeah. Awesome. And Christy, I'm going to answer your question in just a second, but I first wanted to just put something in the chat box for everyone. So I created a quick worksheet for all of you just on how to do a narrative audit. It's pretty simple, but I think hopefully it'll be helpful if you're thinking about doing this over the summer. It's just in a Dropbox folder, so you'll be able to download that pretty easily. The link is in the chat box if you'd like to grab it here after today's session, so feel free to do that. Yeah, so Emily, you said, what about sharing how many hours are volunteered? You know, I think one of the problems with sharing like large numbers, especially like the number of hours volunteered or the number of people helped, is that sometimes people can't conceptualize what that large number really means. I think about that with a number of my clients who have really outstanding statistics that really speak to kind of the broad impact that they have in the community. And yet for the average person who's looking at that number, they're like, well, what does that actually mean to me? What's the context for me to understand that piece of information? So I would really encourage you to think about, you know, telling the story of why that's important. Why is it so noteworthy that people have volunteered so many hours? What does it mean for your organization? What does it mean for the people that you serve? Those are questions I think that will help you dig a little bit deeper into that and to be able to share that story in a really meaningful way. All right, Christy, I'm going to answer your question here. So you said, how do you suggest we handle historical account when, how do you suggest we handle when historical accounts conflict with each other? For example, founding dates and founding reasons. Oh, that's a really good question. I'm not sure. I would think that I would go with, if there was a conflict in information, I would most likely go with the piece of information that has the most evidence to support it. Sometimes it's a difference of opinion, especially if your organization has multiple founders or maybe your founder left on bad terms. There can be all sorts of drama like that, right? That impacts the organization's history and, you know, people's understanding of that history. Ultimately, you have to go with something though that makes the most sense for your organization, which, you know, is hopefully the thing that's most likely to be true. And, you know, most likely to be able to have evidence to support it should someone ask you whether, you know, a little bit more about that information. So that's what I would do. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you on that. I know it must be tough, though, having different information about, you know, sort of historical accounts of your organization's founding. Yeah. Yeah, Kristen, I think that's a really good suggestion. What about why they volunteer their time to this organization? What is it about the organization that inspires them to give their time? Yeah, I think those are really good, useful questions to think about. Fantastic. So I hope this has been a really generative conversation for a lot of you, just thinking about this narrative structure, what it means for your organization, and how you can sort of strategically use it a little bit more. I've given you a couple of examples, I hope, just around how to look at, you know, other organizations, how they're positioning their narrative, what that means for your organization and your own differentiators. And I hope it just gives you some good food for thought as you're thinking about these things over the summer. I did just want to let you know about two things before we wrap up here today. One, we will be back next Tuesday yet again with another episode of Summer Fundraising. And next week we have our first guest, and I'm really excited about it. My longtime friend and mentor, Mark Pittman from the Fundraising Coach, is going to be joining me, and we're going to talk about developing yourself as a leader, which is such a cool topic. I'm so excited to talk about it. Mark and I are going to talk a little bit more about how you actually can develop your own sort of personal development plan to build up your leadership skills and be a leader wherever you are in your organization. So it should be a really cool conversation about leadership and career growth, which Mark and I will discuss, and we'll of course be answering lots of your questions. I also wanted to let you all know too, we have a community group over on Facebook if you'd like to join us there. It's a closed group. We have lots of great discussion and accountability that's happening. Just below the screen here, you'll see a large green button that says Join the Storytelling Nonprofit Lounge, which will take you directly over to the page on Facebook. So if you'd like to join us there in between these calls each week for great discussion and connection, feel free to do that as well. And Sarah, you asked me if I sell my book directly. I don't. It's only on Amazon right now, although I sell it through Amazon. So hopefully that's useful for you. If you have trouble buying through Amazon, I know some people sometimes can't do it. So let me know and I can see if I can get a copy to you another way. You can just send me an email. All right. Yeah, so I'm excited for next week as well. I hope a lot of you come back and let people know, let your friends and colleagues know about what we're doing here, and feel free to share the wealth and information with them. So it's great to have new folks join us. In the meantime, I hope you have a great rest of the day and a great week, everyone. Take care.